please. Thank you so much, Don. All right, everyone. Great to see you all on here. I know we're going to still have some more folks trickling in, but want to get started because this is an incredibly in-depth and wonderful, complex topic. This training is a 90-minute session, so I don't want to take more time than we need. I appreciate those who are taking the time out during their day to be here and join us. So thank you for being here. This is the third session now in the leadership training series that we offer this week from the Manhattan Borough President's Office. I am Eric Cuello. I am the Director of Community Affairs for the Manhattan Borough President. We are joined today by the Perception Institute and Afua Adoo, who will be presenting on behalf of the Perception Institute on combating implicit bias. Um, Before we get started, I just want to thank the borough president for their support in getting this series going. It's something that we look forward to and we hope you look forward to every year. We appreciate you being here for this one of our three mandatory sessions between conflict of interest, which happened yesterday evening, this session on implicit bias, and then tomorrow evening session on equal employment opportunity. But I would be remiss if I didn't make a plug for some of the other trainings that we have coming up. You've probably received via email, but this evening we're going to have a training, a brand new one on understanding housing finance, which we're really excited to present for the first time. We know how much the boards do when it comes to ULURP actions and understanding the needs of the community and how to communicate those to developers or interested parties, the city. So being able to put the board in the best position to leverage its power when it comes to housing questions. So that's going to be happening this evening at 5. So I just wanted to make a plug for that. Um, we're all here for implicit bias. So just want to, as I mentioned, thank the borough president, but I'd also like to thank Keisha Sutton James for her support on this, to Porfirio Figueroa, who all of our presenters know really does an incredible amount of work in getting everyone together, making sure that this runs. So I want to thank Porfirio and I want to thank Dawn, who's our administrator, for, we wouldn't be here without her. With that, I will pass it over to Porfirio to handle introductions and take us away.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eric. So my name is Porfirio Figueroa, and I am the community coordinator for the Manhattan Borough President's Office and liaison to Community Boards 11 and 12. I have the great privilege to introduce Afua Adoo. But first, I'd like to mention something a little about the Perception Institute. The Perception Institute is a consortium of researchers, advocates, and strategists who translate cutting edge mind science research on race, gender, ethnic, and other identities into solutions that reduce bias and discrimination and promote belonging. They work in sectors where bias has the most profound impact, such as education, healthcare, media, workplace, law enforcement, and civil justice. Their vision is to work towards a world that is free from discrimination and other harms linked to cultural and social identity differences. Now, with that, um, uh, Afua Adoo is Deputy Director of Programs and Training at Perception Institute, a trauma focused mental health specialist who specializes in the intersections of trauma, justice, and equitable trauma informed service provision. A nationally recognized advocate, Afua supported White House roundtables in 2015 and 16, intervening public systems, interrupting the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, and has administered training to over 20,000 people. Wow. Afua creates municipal, state, and federal training curricula and has successfully created court based programming to transform approaches to gender based violence and address the needs of systems involved women and youth within New York State Unified Court System. She has consulted with A Call to Men, Women's Prison Association, and the Southern Poverty Law Center, and is on the board of Girls for Gender Equity. And with that, it is great privilege and honor to introduce Afua Adoo.
Thank you so much. That was so kind and so robust. I was like, who is this person? But more so, I am always my pleasure to be in great company and community with my fellow New Yorkers. And so the only thing that was truly left out of that that's really, I would say really true is that I am a native Brooklynite and a proud New Yorker. And it is again, my honor to join you all and share with you all the expanse of the work at Perception. But before I get started, it would be remiss to ignore that in the last 24, 36, 48 hours, we have experienced significant reminders, right, of the differences among us, the perceived differences. So I want to just kind of level set, and our moment of silence can be 5 seconds, but I just want to acknowledge impact, real impact and harm across the globe and certainly across our city. So with that, just a moment. Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't know who all has been impacted on this call, but I not only am from Brooklyn, I am from the Bushwick area of Brooklyn and believe for a long time that I am Puerto Rican by community, but I'm also just a citizen of the world and a citizen of this great nation. And so I would love to bring you into our work. And before um, transferring over to some of the tech challenges, I want to share the application that I use oftentimes clips and will make it a little bit of a challenge for me to sometimes bring you in. So you might have to, as you all are aware, see the behind the scenes in order to make sure that we all have access right to the right material. But if you are unable to see, please let me know, because what can happen with this application as well is that I will be talking and I think I am advancing slides that you all have access to, and that very well may not be the case. So feel free to interrupt me. I haven't had a chance to ride the subway today, so a little human interaction won't do me any harm. As Mr. Figueroa shared, we bring together a great deal of research, and because of that, it oftentimes focuses on the larger society and population pools. And I share this because the gender binary is strictly reinforced throughout a lot of the research. So we're oftentimes looking at relationships and engagements between men and women, and it can ignore or really exclude the experiences of trans-identified folk, gender non-conforming folk, or individuals along the gender spectrum, as well as the emphasis on the racial binary. And so I will, in the next couple of minutes, review with you some of the reasons as to why there is an overemphasis in these continental United States on the racial construct and racial categories that we are often placed into or asked to align with. Because of that, our overall emphasis is to just help people understand. Well, my emphasis is to help people understand how their brain processes difference and identity, ultimately working towards workplaces where we experience dignity and belonging. This is dynamically important because, as I will share with you in a couple of the upcoming studies, when we experience identity harm, when we are undermined, when we are asked about, or when we are misgendered, when we are miscategorized, when we are mocked seemingly or sarcastically for an accent, a pronunciation, or our names, it has significant impact on our physiological presence, just the very way our bodies process and move throughout the day. And so that is the reason why I am dedicated to this. I've known this for many years, my whole life really living in this body and in this identity, that I have experienced something when I feel as though I am not seen or heard. And how then does that impact our interactions with the systems, institutions, and then of course the people on a day-to-day basis, especially in a city like New York. And so for the next hour or so, I will review the role of identity and belonging relative to our perception of identity. And then I'll break down a bit of the mind sciences, which reviews a few attributes of neuroscience of bias. But the three that we emphasize will be implicit bias, and I'll do a little identity, anxiety, and stereotype threat because they are concentric circles of experiences that lead into one another. And I'll share a few ideas for how to repair in the moment, in a way that leads to ongoing relationship or ongoing interaction. What we don't want are people to experience identity harm and then altogether lose a relationship. And I'm before I go on to the next slide, I'm naming what happens in our healthcare system or in our experiences in clinical engagement. If we perceive that our identity in any way can undermine our interaction to fair and equitable treatment. So if you are in a clinical setting with someone who has the authority and power, studies tell us that it will take about 3 different attempts for us to return to that relationship. And we can see that throughout our communities and of course historically, in certain populations, in certain communities, how the relationship between clinicians or educators or even politicians has widened, right? The gap has widened over time if the right language, if the right awareness is not shared across lines of difference. So I'll be using terms like lines of difference, identity harm, to reference individuals and our interactions. When I say line of difference, I just mean talking to someone who is different from you, across different gender, different racial category, different ethnicity, and or different language, and so forth. So now comes the part where we kind of dissect what we've been taught, what we haven't been taught, what we know, and what we think we know. Our relationship to knowing is really important at a time like this. One of the reasons I level set at the very beginning is because I don't know who's in the room, right? And we are a nation on the precipice of some of the most anxious and fraught times, the most anticipatory anxiety, I believe is what we would call it, over the next 12 days, I believe, 12 or 11 days. And so I want to acknowledge that there's a great deal that you all are coming to this workshop with based on your lived experience, based on your identity. There's a great deal that you are open to learning. And then there's what you don't know and what you may never know until you get to the other side. I'm encouraging you to be open, and more so encouraging you to take this information beyond our time together today. And so to that, what you need today or what is required when we have conversations around topics such as this. I heard the upcoming roster and calendar talking about things like economics and housing stability and access. And what often gets lost in those conversations or what gets lost in those interactions is how to do it, right? How to actively listen, how to actively be present, how to hear information and not disconnect or disassociate, but to lean into that discomfort to be curious even more. So I share this with all of my participants around being fully present and actively listening in a time when we have multiple devices at our fingertips. So yes, multitask in the best way. I encourage you to do that because some of what you might hear today may be hard to hear. I'm hoping it won't be traumatizing, but in the event, just be prepared for the lived experiences of others, right? Often if we are in person, what's said here stays here, but often in the chat, right? People might share something. It may be best practice not to bring that up at another meeting, but to be in touch with someone if someone raises something here today and ask if it's something that can be brought offline. That is a really helpful way to maintain a brave space of exchange. If you do share, helpful to speak about your experience, of course. And in the same vein, helpful to recognize the intent is important, but that the impact is what we really emphasize. We want to make sure that we are aware that harm just can be done. And the first reaction should and is often encouraged to be, I'm sorry. Not I'm sorry if, I'm sorry that, I'm sorry, but just I'm sorry. And then being mindful of whom in the room has shared, not shared, what is uncomfortable, what is unfinished. Some of what we talk about today, there may not be a resolution to because we are still a nation learning and unlearning about our shared heritage and of course, our history and our past. And so to that, I do my best to bring together and galvanize about 500 years of history, to talk about all aspects of the amazing tree that we make up. But at times I might miss some things. So I'm encouraging a lack of perfection, but also some grace as I navigate a significant amount of content. And at the same time, I am the work doing the work, right? I am in an impacted body and an identity, living in a very loud part of Brooklyn right now. It is as though as soon as this webinar started, construction started down the block. So thank you for your patience. And of course, feel free to use the chat to ask some questions and to lift up some concepts. So where does this work begin? Oh, and let me share this too. You all may have been in concert with my colleague, Rachel Godsill, co-founder of Perception. And some of what you hear today, you've probably already heard or probably seen. And that is actually a good thing, because bias override, the ability to change and shift our biases and the ways in which we perceive others and ultimately act and behave towards others, can be changed with repetition, right? Repetition with this information. And we know this is possible because our media, our education inundates us with similar stereotypes and schema about people. However, what does this look like in our communities? What does this look like on the ground? Well, here in these United States, oh, I just want to catch his hand, and I want to know if it's possible to hold hands, because it seems.
Sorry,
Oh,
that
you're
was,
not able to see the slides.
yeah, we wasn't able to see the slides, so we
Yeah,
were
I
just,
appreciate that. Thank
thank
you.
you.
Let me just double check. And are you able to see this?
It might be loading. It says you started screen sharing, but it is not yet showing.
Can you give me 1 second? I need to close a window.
No problem.
All right, let's try this again. And my apologies. Are you able to see this?
Now we see a slide. It's titled Where Anti-Bias Work
Yes,
Began.
so that's what you should be looking at. Yes,
Great.
where
Thank you.
anti-work. Okay, thank you. And feel free to jump in and let me know if you're not seeing anything, and I apologize. I want to also go back because I was sharing these agreements and moving through them pretty quickly, inviting you all to the space and to how we engage challenging conversations around identity. It does require significant active listening and centering yourself and the impact of your words and actions over your intention. We have a natural inclination to center our intentions because of the interpersonal anxiety that comes up when a harm has been made or someone has expresses a negative reaction to something that has been said or done. We tend to want to calibrate ourselves and make right, as opposed to making the other individual feel right. And a lot of that has to do with our own proximity to power and position or authority. However, in this instance, or moving forward as a nation, we're asking and inviting folk to really center the impact and emphasize. And over the weekend, if you've been paying attention to television, that's been a challenge for a lot of grownups to do, right? There's been a lot of apologizing and not a lot of focusing on the impact of one's words and actions or inactions. However, I want to take us back about 20 years to where an emphasis on anti-bias research began, right? The conversation's been ongoing for time immemorial. And in a moment, I'll even show where in the 1930s, there was a significant science dedicated to this review. But this particular study wanted to just take a look at some blind items, particularly medical records, and where bias could be identified in some of our lowest hanging fruit in the society, and found that, of course, among babies, significant biases were being experienced in emergency rooms where they were presented with acute abdominal pain. In this instance, the majority appendicitis was identified. And they found that without any pre-existing conditions linked to both economics, ability to pay, physiological impairments, and or demographics, location, proximity to healthcare, whether or not the family and or that child had a primary care physician. All of those covariates taken into consideration still found that white children and Black children experience significant differences in their interactions with clinicians, even when those clinicians shared identity with the families and or the child. And so, as you see here, white children on average received 3 times the response, the opioid pain medication, pain management, as compared to Black children. And whereas we're looking at things like complexion or size, those do factor in, but ultimately individuals received information about their patient before they interacted with them. So what was it about that medical record or those notes, those clinical notes, that insinuated less or different treatment, right? And so over time, we not only take a look at that study, but where this has manifested in other areas of our interactions. I often share that in New York City, it can be a challenge to talk. It can be a challenge, but it's also a positive challenge in talking about identity harm and the role of bias, primarily because of how our culture's identities come together and amalgamate. And at the moment, we're having a twofold conversation about the role of religious identity, ethnic identity, and of course, the racial categorization that America holds and has been holding for since the 1670s. Because of this, right? Because of this recent uptick in rhetoric and hatred, we have returned to conversation. We've returned to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlined specific protections along religiosity and spiritual alignment. However, this conversation is being missed in our day-to-day interactions, and we know this because of the rise in hate crimes across the nation, concentrated in areas like North Brooklyn or down in South Brooklyn, out in Queens as well. But how this shows up in our interactions, what this means for the health and the vitality of our city is that when individuals who are assigned with the role and responsibility of authority, of judgment, of impacting the lives of others, their ability to be experts is significantly reduced and can impact and the ways in which we ensure accountability to safer and healthier communities, right? We think about who are in positions of leadership, of power, and certainly direct service, and who our frontline responders are. They are individuals who are doing the work and also being the work at the same time. Again, another cry for why this conversation is dynamically important. I'm coming out of this because I want to share with you a video, very short video that was the precursor to some legislation changes, some enhancements to legislation at the National Association of Realtors. And so now, as of 2023, all their elected officials and legislatures at the National Association of Realtors were required to sit through the same workshop. However, fast forward a year later, where we are now, every single licensed real estate agent is required to have this conversation and engage in this coursework. And this is significantly important because of the ways in which those individuals have been trained and educated over the years. They've been trained that they don't have an identity as a realtor, that they actually kind of walk in as a clean slate and can use their own objective view and vantage point to gauge, right, the readiness of a family or an individual to purchase a home. Well, you and I know that there's significant barriers, right, to success when that is on the table and when that is the requirement. And ultimately, we see in America that is wholly divided. And so in addition to, so you're getting the first iteration now of some of the impact perception has made and some of the ways in which we broach this conversation relative to safer and healthier communities. And so this video was shot during the pandemic. The quality of it is a little questionable, but the message remains the same. Again, I'm sharing it to give you a glimpse of not just how the expanse of the work, but also the different disciplines where we see the necessity for having this conversation, of course, understanding the concentric circles of our interactions. Okay, here we are. I believe you can see this screen. Anyone can share a heads up or just let me know if that's possible.
It looks like it might still be loading. It says you started sharing your screen.
Okay, I apologize, but thank you for that feedback.
No
Let's try
problem.
the screen. Do you see
Yep,
Rachel's face?
I can see it. Yes.
Okay, this is what I'd like to share.
Stereotypes and race. So one of the questions that's often confusing is, why do stereotypes about some groups persist and others disappear into the dustbins of history? So I'm Irish Catholic. May not be obvious because of my name or the way I look, but Irish Catholics, particularly poor or working class Irish Catholics, were at one point dehumanized. We were seen as savage, uneducable. We were women, promiscuous. But those stereotypes don't really exist anymore in people's minds. There's only one that people think about and attribute to the Irish, and that frankly has everything to do with drinking. And with that one, it's not a stereotype that actually affects any of us who are Irish as individuals. No one says, oh, we'll invite Rachel to do the lunchtime talk, but not the after dinner talk, because who knows what she would have done. No one does that. Where did the stereotypes go? What happened to Irish identity? Well, the Irish became white, as did the other white ethnics. And that happened over time. It started largely with the war films from World War II, where you'd see, again, different white ethnics in the trenches fighting against the opposition as part of the American effort. And then after the war, that translated into some powerful government programs. The Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration developed a program to guarantee loans for working class families to purchase homes. But there was a catch. Those loans were not available to people of color. If you were Black, Latinx, Hispanic, Asian, the guarantees for loans weren't available at all. And if you were a white family and you were interested in moving into an integrated neighborhood, those loans weren't available to you either. How did this happen? Because there were maps. It's now called redlining, because the maps created segments that were different colors. And if you were in a section of a city that was integrated, it was literally covered over with red. And that meant that no loans were guaranteed for those neighborhoods. So families made a choice to benefit from the guaranteed loans. They had to choose to live in all white neighborhoods. All of this hardened residential segregation, where people who'd been white ethnics moved to suburbs with other white people, including Protestants, and people got to know each other. They had backyard barbecues together, they were in PTAs together, their children went to schools together. And so that's how the stereotypes that used to be really powerful basically disappeared into history. But those groups who weren't allowed into those neighborhoods, who didn't get those federally guaranteed loans, they had stereotypes that remained powerful. But those same stereotypes about having too many children, or being on welfare, or not speaking English, or taking jobs from real Americans, those stereotypes still exist, but they're imposed upon other groups. For example, if you look at a content analysis of what's on television news across politics, Fox News, MSNBC, the networks, all of these contain really high proportions of those stereotypes as imposed upon people seen as Hispanic or Latinx. And those stereotypes are the ones that we're still fighting today.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. And so, as I shared before, in an effort to pull together about 500 years of history, we share that information to bring us up to speed as to why there is an overemphasis on the racial binary in these continental United States. I think it's important to note that I keep saying these continental United States. I was corrected by some high school students a few years ago. I wanted to make it very clear. Are you able to see the screen? Do you see
Not just yet.
multiple people? Not yet. Okay. Well, thank you. We'll try this other method. And
Now we can, yes.
oh, you can. Oh
Yeah.
gosh. Okay, great. And so in bringing us back, where was I? Sharing that it's necessary to kind of concretize a significant amount of history so that we are aware of the overemphasis on the racial binary in these continental United States that I was corrected by high school students around the territories and of course the Commonwealths. So it's fascinating that we are again, 360 on all these conversations, and of course highlighted in most recent conversation around identity and community relative to the island of Puerto Rico. Again, I am deeply offended by recent events, and deeply offended just by the overall hatred rhetoric. So forgive me if I mentioned my disdain and frustration with that over the next couple of minutes with you, but I won't get stuck there. I do think it's important to get out of that. So where are we in identity? Who all makes up this country and conversation, but also why is it so challenging? Often challenging because of the structures that pre-exist or predate identity and identity alignment. What that means is whom we are born as and whom we are assigned as very much ties into then where and how we navigate various systems and institutions, again, in this country. And so the gender identity, the racial category identity, those social identities enact or highlight social inequities, right? We are aware that this is a globe with half women identified folk, and the numbers also indicate half male identified folk. And then there are additional genders along the spectrum, but the binary insists that individuals select and identify and align with male and female only. Recently, I was in Austin, Texas, while there was a GOP rally going on last week. And what was interesting about that is I had to explain, in addition to understanding that there is such a strident and stark gender binary, and I'm sorry, I'm going to get into that in a moment. I don't want to jump ahead of myself, that there are no protocols for assigning gender, same as there are no protocols for assigning racial categorization, that melanin content is a marker of one's cultural and heritage proximity to the Earth's equator, right? The proximity to the Earth's sun. But we get lost in that in these United States because of how society, politics, and economy require, right, or were required to categorize individuals back in the late 1670s. I named that because that was the actual time when a convention was held and those categories were named. But coming out of that, we have the institutions then that we rely on, right? Healthcare, education, real estate, the legal system, and that those systems at times in this country were established before many of us were identified as human, were identified as citizens. And so it's a particularly fraught relationship with these institutions, and definitely would lead to some fraught relationships with one another, again, based on each of our perceived or real proximity to power, influence, and control. And then there is who we are. Who are you as a person? What have you been told about how you look, how you speak, what you eat, where you go, how you worship, and how you love, right? And all of these concentric gears allow bias to kind of live within the nuances of these gears. Going to talk again in a moment about how that happens in the brain and where it comes from. But before I get there, the prevalence of this around the world is insurmountable. Because again, it's important that I highlight the role of the racial constructs that were created back in the late 1670s, because today, the marketing that has happened as a result of these categories means that one identity over another is going to be valued, right? Where is the value placed on certain identities based on the rhetoric and the information? And so while one might assume that Blackness and darkness comes specifically from the continent of Africa, there's other ideas that boil down from Central and Western Europe, that one's darkness meant that they were working out in the field, that they were not an aristocrat, that they in fact were of a lesser value, and that coupled with the expanse and the travel of histories, again, I can't go deep into all of the world history, results in some of the global bias that we see today. And so what you see here is an outline of implicit association test scores. And these tests tested individual responses to associating positivity with whiteness and negativity with darkness. Again, along the complexion gradient. So from lighter complexion to darker complexion, how likely was someone to associate negatively with one over the other? And what it found is that in areas of the world where the population is less than negative 0.1%, where there may be absolutely no individuals from the continent of Africa, the African diaspora living, you find some of the sharpest and the greatest anti-Black ideals and responses and attitudes. You see this in marketing, you see this in political advocacy, and just overall awareness and the experiences, the lived experiences of individuals who visit and or live there and or assigned in these areas. Number 4 from the top is China. I think number 1, if I can remember, is Slovenia, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, and Italy. I'm always surprised by Italy because it's such a dynamically diverse country when you're there. And I lived not too far from there for a year. But again, this was pre 9/11 when I was there. The world has changed significantly because of the rhetoric that has evolved from these experiences. And so because of that, we are a nation, or we are a city, we are individuals who then interact across lines of difference every day and may experience some form of microaggression, which is the large term, identity harm or identity anxiety, which is what it's also called. It's just the invalidations or the inability to gauge and discern exactly what part of your identity is being scrutinized in this interaction and whether or not it's being weaponized against you. And certainly in that moment, you are regulating parts of your body in response to that based on how you have been perceived and stereotyped in the world. And so, of course, we have these reactions and interactions. And because memory lives next door to emotion, coupled with your identity, certain individuals have the ability to be seen in their responses to identity harm, and others not necessarily so. So what does that look like, and how does that manifest among all of us? Let's just take a look, and let me just poll you all for a second. Can you think of what it is about you, or what it is about an individual you believe you notice first? What is the top characteristic you believe you notice first about an individual? Feel free to place it in the chat box. Feel free to tell someone else so they can place it in the chat. But let's think the top characteristics that you believe you perceive in others when you see someone else. So let's take, for instance, New York City. Say you're on the platform, one of those elevated outside platforms. I live near the J train, the JMZ now. Back then there was no MZ, or the M. But if you're near Sutter Avenue, if you're near the Yankee Stadium, anywhere where the train goes outside, there's a particular time of a sunny day where it's hard to see down the platform, right? And if someone ascends the steps and is walking toward you, what are the characteristics that you're looking for? If you can't see their face and all you can see is a figure moving toward you, what are you looking for to give you information either about your safety or well-being or that person as well? Can someone tell me? I'm going to check the chat. No one's mentioning anything in chat, but I'm happy to share myself. Oh, I see.
It should be in Q&A.
Please submit it to the Q&A.
Sure. I'm trying to get there myself, which is tricky because I don't want to pause myself. Let's see. Let me come out and check. I see clothing. I see gender. Gender's close. How someone is dressed. Often we want, but imagine that the vision is skewed, right? And it's very bright. And so maybe you can see that someone's wearing a coat, but you can't see all the details, right? I'm going to help you out and move this on in the interest of time. What we notice first is age. We notice age. Can you see this slide, Eric?
Yeah, I see. Can you guess the first 3 things?
Yeah. So what we notice first is age, and ageism is such a dynamic bias in our society that no one gets age right. As a matter of fact, we fail to realize that the majority of our drugstores, a lot of our retail is geared at procuring youth and vitality, and we tend to actually override age. by assuming people are not equipped, right? We watch this kind of pour out itself in some of the harshest ways over the summer in response to this ongoing election, right? What does wisdom versus age versus cognition really mean to us, and how do we even respond to that? Well, sometimes we respond very harshly, but in most instances, we notice age first, gender second, and racial category right after. Now, we acknowledge race very quickly. Actually, we acknowledge race so quickly that sometimes that might be the first thing we acknowledge, but how we are actually judging individuals, judging your movement toward or your movement away. For women identified folk on the call, think about your own safety, right? How are you judging if you need to move away or towards someone, right? You can usually get a sense by someone's gait, how they're walking, the frequency with which they're moving, sitting or standing up, right? That gives us a great deal of information on one another. But our brains notice race quickly because we are inundated with that information on a daily basis. When we turn on the TV, the suspect is described as Black, white, and other, and so on and so forth, right? When we're telling stories, people are describing what the people look like oftentimes, even if it's not necessary or relevant, because of these very strong schema and attitudes that America has about race and its assumptions about various ethnic groups. And so what do we, oh my gosh, we jumped way ahead. I don't know how that happened, but thank you for your patience because sorry, for some reason this advanced way past where I wanted it to. And so in the interest of time, sorry, I gotta get us back here and apologize again for the mix-up. Also, I want to thank you for your patience in that this is a significant amount of information that I'm moving through quite quickly. And so what I was talking about was the acknowledgement and the awareness of race and gender of race and racial category very quickly because of how often we are inundated with that information. When it comes to gender and sexual identity, that informs our social perceptions of value, with whom we place value on. And often male identified folk are valued at the very top, right? They have the utmost of value, the closest proximity to the highest authority and the highest power and control level. And so because of this, gender identity and sexual identity are wielded and weaponized oftentimes against individuals for whom their social perception of identity is not made salient, right? When I cannot perceive exactly if that individual is male or female, falls into that very specific binary, gender binary, I, in this socialized American identity, want to clarify that because I have been told by this society that there is specific value of one over the other, right? It's not necessarily trying to make right, but trying to make right in my brain of whom receives the value, whom receives the respect. And so I often share gender is what one goes to sleep as, sexual identity is whom one chooses to sleep with. None are any of our business, but they become very salient, very important, again, in how we value and language and talk about one another, of course, and of course, how we manage and supervise and interact, right? I'm sharing this study a little early because one of the major schema or stereotypes that bubbles up around gender and sexual identity are very strong stereotypes that we fall into, that actually this last week someone said to me he was unaware of how strong his stereotype around women driving was, and that he had gotten that stereotype from his grandfather, and now in his 50s he was thinking how old and antiquated that bias is, but how salient it is in his daily interactions, right, with his daughters and with his students and the clients he serves. Listener bias is so dynamic that we tend to assume its efficacy. We just tend to assume that this is just the way it is. In mixed gender settings, men always speak more than women do. They speak more words, which is contrary to the stereotype of women being nagging, women being very verbose, women kind of talking with over emotion, right? They're more likely to be interrupted, and women identified folk on this call would know, right, that their contributions to a meeting or to a project oftentimes are overridden and acknowledged and assumed by the men in the room. Now, this is a challenge when we talk about the gender spectrum, because the assumption of maleness then is placed on individuals either who do or don't identify. And because of that assumption, right, the value then spikes if one is closer to the perceived stereotype of maleness versus the perceived stereotype of femininity, or not necessarily femininity, womanhood. Where we see this manifest in our children, or we see this manifest in academia, or just in the development of academic behavioral dynamics, is how we then perceive the age and the responsibility of individuals. So this particular study was released back right before the pandemic, and oddly enough, bubbled to the surface throughout the pandemic as children started to protest and engage law enforcement in peaceful manner, right? And so we find that Black children or Black girls, however, in this particular study, are perceived as developmentally older and more culpable, less likely to be aware of how accountable they are for their actions, but more so subject to more punishment. This is something that had been at some point pandemic to New York City in terms of how they responded to youth in the legal system. Oftentimes very young children, young girls who were housing unstable, who were in shelters and or in foster care, were perceived and often charged and or jailed along with adults and perceived as adults and adultified. So it was a significant movement back in 2016, 2017 to address that here. And so overall, when addressing the real dynamic impact of how our brains perceive bias on one another, it's important to acknowledge what's been naturalized, right, as opposed to what is natural. And I shared briefly earlier that there are no scientific protocols, for instance, for gender assignment at birth. That is it becomes an arbitrary test, if one would say, one that is up to the clinicians and the doctors at the time. And so we hear many stories of individuals in their adulthood who have reclaimed their proper gender assignment, much to the chagrin of the public, who is still grappling with the idea that gender exists on a spectrum, in the same way that identity of racial categorization exists not in boxes, but along a spectrum. We are right now watching someone petition for the job, one of the highest jobs in the world, right? And her identity, the binary of her identity is being questioned. Is she Black? Is she Indian? Can she be both? Of course. And so the mind sciences, again, takes a look at we're going to take a brief look at implicit bias, identity, anxiety, and stereotype threat. Implicit bias is your brain's instant automatic association of a stereotype or attitude toward a particular group. And so thinking about, again, that being on that trained platform and not just trying to identify who that person is, but many of you named clothing. And so there's a great deal of judgment made by clothing based on one's presentation. But very quickly, we're able to associate an idea with that individual. And there's a preference or an aversion to a person or a group of people or a thing. And we all have bias. If you have a brain, your brain has the ability to discern, to keep you safe. But that safety, when it comes to people, is based on information given to you by other people, right? And it's not a fair or equal or even a complete assessment of other individuals. And so I'm inviting you to take a look at this screen. You might have seen a little bit of it before, but this is the Stroop task that was created in 1935 to help the brain get a sense of what the unconscious and conscious brain are doing when trying to discern information. Oftentimes, I ask people to unmute themselves and engage this activity in unison, but I'm going to ask you to do this at your desk with your colleague or not. You can do it alone, but I'm urging you to speak this aloud if you are capable. The colors are going to appear on the screen, and I simply want you to state the color of the text as it appears. I'm going to be moving them along pretty quickly, so keep up. And also keep in mind that these are all primary colors. No lime green or pink are going to be in the mix, okay? And so I'm going to start this on the count of 3, and I want you to move through it as you would, identifying anything, okay? Here we go. Don't forget to say it out loud. Okay. So if you got to the end of that and you're not frustrated, good for you. But if you got to the end and you said, what did you do? You switched something up, then you're right. And you're probably multitasking at the time. But if you figured it out and you were able to actually state the color of the text as it appeared on the screen without any problem, you probably balanced the checkbook this morning or probably managed a couple of projects before our time together today. Your brain has already been rigorous and active. What I just did there is I asked you to state the color of the text and I asked you to read. And because your brain knows that it's smart, it probably got to the second row, second column and said, we know what the color is, but we also know how to read because I'm a smart brain. And so in that instance, your unconscious, and your conscious brains were at conflict with one another. See, if you can think back to maybe your second or third month of life, I'd ask you, what did you learn first, your colors or your words? You learned your colors first, right? But that moment of pause where you're thinking, well, what did I learn first, comes from the fact that when you then learned how to read, how to identify letters, and then how to identify words, you experience a social reward, right? People around you were excited. They were handing you other things to read. Maybe you got to school and there was some anxiety along with that, with reading in front of your classmates, right? All of those hormones and enzymes that were released indicate your feeling, your thought, and emotion. And so around reading and identifying words, even more so if you are uh, uh, speak more than one language, right? Your brain is primed to discern significant information very fast. And so because of that, your brain doesn't need to see all of the words, right? If you're driving down the highway, or if you're on the train and there's something left out of a sign, you don't need to see all the words to fill it in because reading became your rote response, unconscious. Color identification, however, now requires object permanence. So take a look around your room and see if you can identify a color without seeing the item it's connected to. Can you look around your room and see a color? Do you see pink in your room? Do you see blue in your room? Now, do you just see blue and not the item? Do you just see green and not the item? It's really hard to do that. Now, even someone who wears glasses, right? I can take off my glasses and it'll be blurry, but I don't just see the color and not the thing, because color blindness is not psychologically normative for the human brain, right? We must actually permanent the item that it's attached to in order to identify it, right? And I hear it also reads that the brain takes in 11 million bits of information per second. It can only ascribe feeling, thoughts, and emotions to 40 bits of those information, bits of that information, that data. So you're not always thinking about your body's relationship to the Earth's gravitational pull. You're not always thinking about, your body's respiration or blood processing. No, you're actively thinking of thoughts. If you stepped on something, it's hard. If you ran your hand underwater, it's cold or it's hot, right? That's the way in which that's the information your body can ascribe information to. Why is it so hard then or why is it so challenging to complete a task and not think about a task? There are many things you complete in a day, right? Think about pouring yourself some coffee in the morning. Now take a look at this task again and see if you can do this. Now I want you to think about getting up in the morning and you're about to pour yourself your favorite cup of tea or your favorite cup of coffee or your favorite smoothie, okay? Or maybe it's just water. Now take a look at this screen again, and I'm going to ask you to repeat the shoot task. Slow down a bit so that you're mindful of the change and see how quickly you get through this, okay? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to have the last row backwards. That was just a formatting issue. But one of the reasons I rerun this is because we think we are able to override our bias, or we think we're able to actually be mindful. And I often encourage people to think of the role of an ER nurse, right? Or someone in triage of a level 1 center like Kings County or Bellevue, right? If you have frequent identities coming through the door, it can be a challenge to discern specific details in each one, but it can be easier to quickly categorize those individuals. Think about law enforcement, or think about a court officer, someone who is at the front door of a courthouse, right? Processing all these individuals in, getting them to go through security, right? It can be challenging to see each individual as one person, but it's much easier to group them all in, right? All of the men, all of the young folks, all of the women, et cetera, and so on. And so because you have all of this information moving through your brain relies on what I call the Google Drive, your own file cabinet of images to help you get through the day, because you cannot stop and ascribe 40 feelings, thoughts, and emotions to every single thought and interaction you have. So take a look at this screen and tell me if you can identify how many triangles are in the screen. I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure I'm mindful and keeping us moving. Screenshot this if you have young people in your life. This is a great activity for the holidays and will keep them occupied for a few minutes. The Stroop task is also available on YouTube if you would like to work through an implicit association test with your loved ones over the holidays as well, or with your team and colleagues. But this is a great way to test, right, how quickly our brains are processing information. And folks, there are no triangles in this image because a triangle requires 3 complete sides and 3 complete angles. And I've had people try to argue me down on this, and you're not going to win, right? These are not complete triangles, but you know what a triangle looks like because you've seen one your entire life. You have seen triangles in everything, right? It's one of the first shapes you receive when you're playing toddler games, right? And so again, because you have seen triangles over the years, your brain relied on the idea in your Google Drive, in your brain, the image of a triangle to fill in. And so you saw them. You probably see Christmas trees and all kinds of angles in this, right? Your brain is processing so much information, it can be a challenge to discern. And so because of that, your brain requires schemas, those mental shortcuts, the Google Drive. You go there, you get the information, you plug it in, and then you're able to engage the public or the people that you're serving or the multiple identities coming across from you. But when it comes time for you to interact and engage, speak, or behave toward them, oftentimes we're relying on stereotypes that inform our attitudes. We rely on those, especially in this country, if you've been socialized here, and I keep saying the word socialized, because that indicates someone who has spent more than 4 to 6 years in a given place. That is enough time for them to be acclimated to the social mores, the social leanings and behaviors of an area. And so whether or not you're from that area, over time you pick up. I often say, before I get to a location, the stereotype about me has gotten there, because there's nothing like the marketing of relative, as you saw in that earlier study, of anti-Blackness across the world, the universe, right? And so these stereotypes, these traits and characteristics that are associated with individuals, with people that live on for days that Rachel was talking about, coupled with our attitude, indicates how we treat and how we respond, and certainly indicates how that person receives it. How that person receives it or how we talk about it, though, relies on something even bigger. And one of the reasons, and again, I apologize for speaking so fast, but I'm trying to get all this information in before our time ends. One of the reasons I focus on us doing that group activity is because something unique happens when we are in a group setting. And this was found out when jury pools were researched. About 15 to 20 years ago, up until that time, a majority of jury pools across the nation were comprised of white identified individuals, predominantly white male individuals, because of, and you all probably know, right, because of the many challenges one would have to ensuring the efficacy of their voting rights, right? In order to access the jury, you must be an active registered voter. And so these jury pools were a perfect place to get a sense of how groupthink impacted stereotyped ideas and treatment of others. And it found that when looking at a group of individuals who are primed with making an important decision that impacted someone else's life, so this jury making a decision that impacted someone else or a family, right? That their authority measure rate was raised, right? So that boasted their ability, their power and control in that moment. And what it found was that if a member of that actual group, not necessarily the defendant that they were talking about, right, but that actual group, that in that group dynamic, if something shifted and changed, the language about that individual shifted as well. And so in-group preference acknowledges that when someone from that group is like that group, right, we tend to, not we, but individuals of that identity tend to blame or allow context for that person to extend beyond their identity. So this is what that looks like. If a member of that group who is white identified is coming to jury duty late, running late for that, how they would talk about that person is that that person may have been stuck in traffic, that there were environmental factors that could have interrupted their ability to show up on time. But when the individual is identified within the margins of the margins, so not white, not male, and oftentimes not white and female, that individual is oftentimes labeled or languaged relative to their character. They then were blamed for their action or inactions, not the environment. So it wasn't traffic, but it was just their inability or ability or their willingness to join, right? Or whether or not they had even taken the proper time. So one other kind of insidious remark would be maybe they were hung out late last night, right? Which kind of indicates their seriousness or their readiness. And ultimately, because our brains want to be right, remember back the Stroop task when you were reading the colors and the words, because your brain wants to be right, if that person shows up and actually says, oh my gosh, can you believe I overslept? I was up late last night and I didn't set my alarm. The brain's gonna go, that's what I thought. They're never on time, right? Not listening to the context in that moment, but very, very quick and very ready to assume what would be attribution error, right? What happens when the person you think fits into this stereotype confirms the stereotype. That is confirmation bias. Something else dynamic happens, and this might lean into what we're seeing play out on television in these last couple of weeks. How our brains process difference also impacts how we language and talk about others, particularly when we see them in peril or in hardship. And so this particular study looked at the responses of the nation to individuals, for instance, during Hurricane Katrina. We actively saw individuals in peril and in danger. Why was there such a slow response? Well, ongoing studies will tell you that there is a significant awareness of certain bodies in certain dynamics, that it is easy to see and perceive someone who is darker complexioned angry or happy. But the nuance of emotions in the middle, right, are oftentimes not attributed to people along the complexion gradient. I'm talking just about the perceptions of along the racial binary of white and Black. What is required, and I'm sharing this early just in case we run out of time, but what is required for us to reduce bias is slowing down. It is literally the difference between being kind and being nice. It is that moment when you get to the TSA agent, when you are about to fly or you're about to get on a train and you hand over your documents and they say, thank you, have a great trip, and they hand you back your ticket. You take that and you say, great, thanks, you too. You're being very nice in that moment. You know how to make manners, you know how to see and hear and respond to the person, right? But you told that person to have a nice trip too, right? They're not going anywhere. You probably don't even think about that until you're in your seat long gone. But in a kind encounter, right, you might slow down and say something like, oh, maybe I'll see you on my return trip back. I hope you get a lunch break soon. I mean, all that like witty banter you might have time for. And even if you don't have time, right, sometimes in those instances when you're slowing your brain down and calibrating the difference between yourself and that other person, we're less likely to fall into the trap of relying on stereotype to engage that individual. Have I made mistakes? Yes. Have I returned to repair those mistakes? Absolutely. Have I made mistakes that I haven't been able to repair? Sure, because this language is new. We have advanced about 50 years in the last 25 years. And so it's equally important that you are easy on yourself, that you ask questions in the slowing down process. America is not the society to override bias in, right? Because we believe in the concept of time is money. But time is also biased, right? Time, if we move very quickly, if we're not aware of our actions, our inactions, and the impact of those actions, then we stand to enact a significant amount of bias on other people. There have to be clear expectations and protocols and rules for how something gets done. This has been a challenge at every workplace I've ever had, right? And what it has led to is maybe some undermining of my identity. Am I doing the right thing? Do I know? Am I going the right place? Did they say this? Am I being included because of this reason, or am I being excluded for that reason? Having clear and accessible, orderly and organized rules and regulations, policies and procedures helps people eliminate kind of that benefit of the doubt. And certainly increasing our peer-to-peer group contact, right? How are we experiencing other cultures, identities, and heritages, right? Is it just on television? Are we active? This season is a perfect season to get out. But I want to acknowledge the work of community service that you all engage in, and that the very fact and the very nature of your work leads to overriding bias, that you are inundated with the challenges that all people experience. So you, by very default of your vocation, are engaging in counter stereotyping. But I encourage you to lift this conversation up and talk more about the impact and the necessity of replacing stereotypes, both in our society and in our language, and to be open to extending grace in so doing. Years ago, I was trained by an individual named Ricky Wilkins. And Ricky Wilkins is one of the first individuals to identify as genderqueer. Wrote a book about it. She travels the country and it provides ongoing support. Even did consult for the TV series Pose, and works very closely with RuPaul, et cetera, right? Just on the language of things, because one would think the young people have new language, and here's Ricky Wilkins coining the term 30 years ago. Ricky said to me, it is important that we ask questions, but more important that we just slow down and extend grace. And Ricky said, even in my body and my age, I get things wrong and I may not have it all right. And most people just want to be perceived correctly and respected in those identities. And so where we are as a nation, I oftentimes appreciate talking about the role of trauma and that we all react very differently. But I want to acknowledge that the trauma reaction of the body is the same readiness that the body makes when it experiences an identity harm. The body kind of shuts down all concrete dynamic thoughts, right? And is only focused on regulating blood pressure, body temperature, and heart rate. In that moment that someone is misgendered or miscategorized or mislabeled along with someone else, what I have heard many times is, well, I just said the wrong name. It's not like I did X, Y, and Z. Or I just said this thing and I quickly apologize. I don't understand why they can't just get over it. I didn't mean it, right? And the reason why someone can't just get over it is because the body prepares to protect it from the very same object. See, the body is smart, and the brain is smart, but together they're not the sharpest. What that means is the body prepares to protect the body from a sharp object, but it doesn't know the difference between a sharp object and a sharp tongue, right? It doesn't know that what has been experienced isn't going to continue to harm. The body just knows to protect itself. And so this is why I lean in a little bit on trauma and the dynamics of interpersonal, what happens in that moment, and that the brain is also processing what's ongoing, right? What is looming in that person's life. So for many identities, from the time they leave their house, they are experiencing awareness of their identity and othering, right? If you're a woman identified, maybe you've been catcalled, right? So in that moment, your brain is primed and ready to protect you. Memory lives right next door to emotion, right? So the reason why one might blow up and it might not look like, it might not match the infraction is because the body can't necessarily regulate all the time, right? Those emotions right next to the memory. All it knows is that it feels the same and it feels similar, and we have to get ready to protect ourselves from it. And so in addition to that, we all are not given the same bandwidth to react to those traumatic stimuli, right? So in that moment, if I'm in a job interview and I've been misgendered, or I'm filling out paperwork at any number of institutions, and I feel or I hear as though my identity is a challenge for other people to respect, I'm going to both be regulating my physiological response and my mental response to the moment. Do I want to be here? Do I want to leave? Can I do it? Can I get through the day? Am I hungry or am I not hungry? Like, all of those thoughts are going through at the same time. The body is still trying to get its body temperature, its blood pressure, and its heart rate regulated. If you think about Times Square, it's coming up, right? New Year's Eve. Think about us all being at Times Square. There's 44 of us on this call, 45 of us on this call, and we're ready to see the ball drop. But at about 9 o'clock, if you're still out there, right? Before that happens, maybe a truck backfires down on like 37th Street. Not too far, but loud enough to jar all of us. Our natural reaction, our natural inclination, and you see it right there at the bottom, is to fight. Someone's going to run towards that noise. Some of us are going to run away. Some are going to freeze in place. And then given the circumstances, and usually in an interpersonal harm or an assault, there would be fawning. There would be someone there trying to make it better for everyone, right? But usually that fight, flight, and freeze reactions are normal human reactions. Your body is going to take off from it running at nominal speed. The challenge is that I look very different running at nominal speed for my body than my white male colleague. And this is what we see manifest, right? Individuals essentially do not end up running the same race in society, and how our natural bodies react to stimuli or just the process of protecting itself requires more attention. So in those moments when we acknowledge that someone has been harmed, that someone has been mislabeled or misgendered, it's important to understand that identity anxiety is real, that there is a physiological stress response that the body goes through when one is not feeling comfortable or dignified, or that they belong. The brain in that instance is trying very hard to redirect itself from the stereotype associated with it, right? That in that moment, that body is trying to remain in control of their bodily functions, but also remain in control of the positive stereotype that can be controlled with that. Sometimes people are unable to regulate all of that. It is too much because I'm either too young, right? If I'm under 26 and my prefrontal lobe hasn't fused yet, how am I regulating this? Well, we see this play out in our legal system or in our criminal legal system, right? Our foster youth, right, become incredibly emotionally vulnerable to situations like this. I think, my goodness, about our trans youth. I'm just going to mention years ago, the police precinct and the community board up in North Manhattan going over into South Bronx was having a real challenge with a high arrest of trans youth, transgender youth, gender nonconforming youth, and aged out foster care youth. And the law enforcement in the area, the precincts in that area, didn't understand why they were always out so early in the morning or so late at night, until they did ride-alongs with one of my colleagues who worked with me in the court advocacy at GEMS, Girls Educational Mentoring Services, which responded to girls on prostitution-related charges. And we did ride-alongs with the precinct and explained to them that the safety of these individuals was necessary for both their socializing and the money making, right? That they came out late at night and they were only able to truly feel safe with one another going to these parties and these raves in different areas of, like, up near Hunts Point together, again, regulating their bodies because they were too young really to ask or seek out the help that they needed. However, in the workplace, what this does is it interrupts our interpersonal relationships, our ability to work together. Awkward attempts to connect are often seen. And when I first was introduced to perception, it was at this moment that I thought, I have to work with these people, because they were actually naming that in these interactions, oftentimes white identified individuals will seek out terms and behaviors or interaction that they believe are not representative of racist or biased behavior, but to impacted people, so to people who are Black, Indigenous, persons of color, and so forth, would perceive their behavior and their actions as biased, racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, for sure. And so the emphasis is, again, on the impact of your actions. When one says or misgenders or misquotes or misrepresents themselves or microaggresses, right? The emphasis shouldn't be on that person. Well, you took it wrong, or you didn't do, you took it wrong, or I didn't mean this, or I'm sorry, but, or don't have to make such a big deal about it, right? Because in that instance, that individual then will be burdened with the responsibility of navigating my emotional reaction to it. I want to move past this because that's really detailed, and I want to highlight that our racial perceptions do affect our interactions. Yes.
I just wanted to time check where it's 1:17, so we
looking.
have about 12 minutes left, but I want to make sure we leave some time for questions.
Absolutely. I just want to wrap up this last
Sure.
part And I'm hearing some feedback on yours. If you're able to mute for 1 second, I just want to wrap up this because it's important that I acknowledge that based on a particular study, based on a few studies that looked at our interactions in professional settings, based on our perceived identity, right? Perceived racial categorization in this nation, we have different goals when we interact. And I do think this is important to name because of how we then language and talk about individuals and how we review them based on either in interviews or just in webinar or Zoom-like interactions. Because of one's proximity to authority and power and perception of that, the individual on the right, the white man, his goal in those interactions or in social interactions is to be liked because he can assume respect in many instances. He's not going to be asked to present identification or to verify or justify why he is in a place. And these particular studies were conducted on graduate school campuses, looking at individuals at networking events, professional higher ed events. So we're not looking at people who are trying to gain some social capital, but people who are really trying to make some professional connections. Whereas for Black identified folk in the middle, because they are often stereotyped as unserious or not being astute or academically astute or qualified enough, their goal then is to be respected in these instances and that they might project some seriousness. Whereas their white male counterpart is able to project more warmth and joviality and approachability. This actually can interrupt an interaction, right? It can certainly interrupt one's review of another if someone is interviewing someone or making claim as to why someone can move or advance in their career. Whereas for the Asian American identified individual in the third column, that individual, if they are stereotypically perceived as Asian American, right? So in this instance, a very particular type of identity, they can assume the same respect as their white male counterpart or their white female counterpart, and their goal then is to be liked, which can interrupt potential affinity among persons of color because of the goals are so different. Not just that the goals are different, but the perceptions are different as well. I do want to pause here and get a sense of some questions in the space. Please let me know if you'd like me to read your question aloud, or if you have a particular comment or thought that you'd like me to acknowledge.
Well, thank you, Afua. If you'll allow me to step in, I took some notes, and you remind me of not only why this is important for all of us to do every year, but to be conscious of. Yeah, you also triggered a couple of things because I do remember very succinctly last year doing the color test, and being able to do that, and actually, I was chosen to be the one to actually do it. So, it brought back a lot of memories. But I also I took some notes, and one of the quotes you said was, "The body doesn't know the difference from a sharp object to a sharp tongue," and so you do remind us that, I love that slide where you talked about ways to reduce bias, slow down, be kind, extend grace, have protocols, counter our stereotypes, and to keep asking questions and having these conversations. So this is really phenomenal, and thank you so much. Not only about to be conscious and remember that we have impact on each other. That was also very, very powerful for me to hear. There are a couple of questions, so if you'll allow me, I'm gonna read the first one because it came in kind of early. So this question says, I'd be curious to know your guidance, what it is around how to engage with someone who doesn't recognize a person's gender unless it's assigned gender at their birth. So an imagined situation, imagining if we're discussing a matter that may impact members of the trans community and a community board member or a member of the public expresses they don't recognize that individual's community. How are we supposed to move forward and get things done?
This is a challenge, and I really appreciate this question, but I do know it's a challenge for leadership. And together you'd have to build out a protocol as to whom and how is allowed on you know, the committee, the deciding committee, the team, you know, how that individual. Now, here's the challenge. Are we allowed to have differing views? Yes. However, what we're not allowed to do is dictate who and how humanity is expressed, right? We are not above the universe to meter out this person is human and this person is not. So I do think it is can be an exercise of the committee to ask someone to step down, because that is harmful. That isn't, it actually can be perceived as an assault. And to think back to the 3/5 compromise, right? Assuming that an whole individual could not be perceived as one whole individual unless they had more people with them, right? Just assumes their subhumanity, and that's not the case. It's so not the case because we have scientific proof that there are no scientific protocols for gender. So I hate to go into that area, but for leadership, I often have to explain that what we have been told about what is right and wrong are fallacies. What we have been told about, you know, gender and identity have been told to us, are constructed to align with a very specific way in which society is supposed to be rolled out. And we're seeing that kind of dismantle itself now.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. There are two questions I would love to get in. And one of them is regards, well, I think in the question it's inherent. So, how would you suggest community board members slow down and extend grace at public meetings? Because it is a public session.
Okay, the slowing down can be a challenge with time. I know that the community board member meetings are timed, and people are very verbose. They get a microphone and they go on and on and on. You will have to. So there's two things. One, prior to meetings, there might be an ability to build in some processing. If individuals are aware that they can attend a meeting that is just to process or just to share, the likelihood of taking up time in, you know, those public forums is less likely. Oftentimes we just don't listen because we're not listened to. So providing more opportunities for people to speak across lines of difference or even speak in affinity. I'm a huge proponent of professional identity affinity in workspaces. They have a significant impact. Large corporations might be talking about moving away from DEI, but what they're not talking about is that they are using identity affinity to kind of help uphold some of these bigger challenges. And the identity affinity groups aren't there to make new decisions. They're there to help bridge between leadership and maybe funders or leadership and the direct public, some of those gaps in information. So where microaggressions might happen or where something like the previous question might happen, an affinity group could come up with a real structured protocol or response and with some exercises to work out among one another. And then every couple of months or a couple of times a year on a quarterly basis, all of those groups should come back together and have an opportunity to reassess and talk about progress made or some of the challenges that they're having in a particular area, workspace, or on a shared committee.
Thank you.
Mhm.
The other question I see here is like, now that we are engaging more with people virtually, um, and we don't exactly have the advantage of seeing physical cues, how do you become aware or stay aware of biases?
I think it's important to acknowledge that biases are going to be hard to override. The nation is committed. One of my colleagues works very closely with children's television programming over at Netflix and the Sesame Workshop. And I'm naming that because we pour through pages and pages of cartoon renderings because it is almost and nearly impossible to shift the narrative of associating certain colors with certain animals and with drawing certain characters of color larger than their white counterparts. And so we are still working to override this, and the public can make requests of, you know, media. There was significant backlash in less than 24 hours. We can have anchor folk removed from their posts. We can hold individuals accountable for being better models of doing this work, or being better citizens of the globe to one another, and certainly being mindful of how young people are doing this and talking to one another. They have shattered a lot of the boxes that many of us have grown up in. And so I urge you to engage a conversation with Gen X and Gen Alpha. They are missed and kind of shocked and surprised that we are still holding. And when I say we, these older generations are still holding on to some of these ideals. But again, as I mentioned, they're not aware that technology and society has advanced about 50 years in the amount of time of only like 25 years. So grace, ease, being mindful, and certainly exploring and engaging content. There are a great deal of books, documentaries. One I'll share is called Disclosure on Netflix. It's a wonderful documentary of the role of race, gender, even class in Hollywood, and how I don't know which generations are on the call, but if you're in your 40th, 50th, and 60th decade of life, there are particular TV shows and certain episodes that we all watched. Remember, we all didn't have 800 channels. We all watched that told us how we should interact with other people, how we should respond to other people. Disclosure is about a particular episode of Family Guy that told all of us how we should respond to transgender individuals in America. We all watched the same movie too that taught us how to do the same thing. And with that awareness, we can override it.
Thank you so, so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for trying to tackle this very, very monumental topic. We do hope the Perception Institute comes back. We would love to have you back. Adoo, Miss Adoo, I have to tell you that this had great impact on me. This is something that's very, very important to this office. So, on behalf of the Manhattan Borough President, on behalf of Keisha Sutton James and our team here at the Community Affairs team and our director, Eric Cuello, we so, so thank you in the Perception Institute. We thank everyone who has been on this webinar today, and we want to let you know it will live on our YouTube channel once the entire series is done. You're welcome to take the other series as well. And I also want to say that if there are questions, and Afua, I hope this is okay, but if there are other questions that you want to submit, please submit in directly either to myself or Eric, and we will get them to the Perception Institute and have them answered for you. And again, we cannot thank you enough. This is a topic, again, like I just said, so important to us. And thank you for just literally just starting our journey, and continuing our journey to being conscious of each other.
Thank you. My pleasure, as always. Y'all have a wonderful rest of your week, and happy voting.
Yes, indeed. Bye bye.